Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming again. Today we are covering chapter 6, which is the June 1967 war was a war of no choice. The important thing about this, why this is an important myth, I don't know how much that is understood or thought about in the world, but in Israel itself, when you grow up there, you're always taught from the beginning that all the wars that Israel has been through, including 1967, were imposed on us. That we have never done anything wrong, and people just hated Israel because it's a Jewish state, and they wanted to throw us all to the sea. So we're just defending ourselves. So in the context of that, this is why it's so important to debunk this myth. And today, James is going to help us from the United States. Hello, James. James is summarizing the chapter for us. And so, James, when you're ready, your presentation, you can share your screen with your presentation and take it from there. And then we'll do what we usually do, which is have a good discussion afterwards. James, did you say you're in Oklahoma? Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah,
Oklahoma.
not an easy place to be in at the moment.
It's between a rock and a hard place, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, there we
Okay.
go.
Okay. With chapter 6, it's the final chapter of the portion of the book, part 1, The Fallacies of the Past. And with that, I think that Ian does a good job of bringing together all of the factors that came into play with the 1967 war and how that strategy came to be. Because in this chapter, he actually starts talking about, with his previous chapters, we found out how Palestine was not an empty land, that it was very much a working society where everybody was integrated and there was no real friction other than what was going on with the Ottoman Empire. We found that the Jews were not a people without a land, that it was based on an ideology that drew people into a religion that was used to justify the occupation. We see that Zionism, even up to today, is tried to be conflated with Judaism, but that's not the case. The political ideology and the religious aspect of it are two different things. And we need to make that more clear, because especially with where we're going in the United States with the events that happened over the weekend, I see the continued vilification of supporting Palestinian liberation and the further infringement of our rights. And when the president and his staff can say that you don't have to be Jewish to be Zionist and that they are, in fact, Zionists, then the argument that these are equal becomes moot. And I think that Ian did a good job in delineating both and showing us that it is not, in fact, the religion itself. Zionism is not colonialism. It is. And from the very beginning, the actions of the state have shown, and even the principles that Herzl set forth in his book, it was very clear what the intention of the Zionist forefathers were. With number 5, the Palestinians left voluntarily, that's not true either, because there was a lead up to the declaration that Israel was a state in which the people were systematically displaced. And there were instances where they were being ethnically cleansed before the state was even declared. So that brings us to 1967 was the war of no choice. And what I think Ian really tells us there is that it was like establishing new boundaries. Because up until that point, they had used the mandates, emergency orders, to lay the groundwork for what would actually happen here in the 1967 war. With the first paragraph, Ian sets the tone for not just what's going on in his current events, but so much of what we see happening even up to today. The author explains how, after 1948, the Zionists saw the missed opportunity to seize the West Bank as Bachia Literat, or a fatal historic mistake.
It's called Bchia Ledorot. It means lamenting through the generations. Regret. It means terrible regret or fatal historic mistake, like he says. Bchia Ledorot, yeah.
So I think that right there was the impetus. And later on, he mentions the Greater Israel lobby that was operating within the state at that time. So what they had was a problem with the demographic issue, which was Ben Gurion's holdout in wanting to take the West Bank to begin with. Oops. Just as in the past, like Ben Gurion employed a policy of carrying out provocations that hampered any prospects of peace, each ideation hampered rather than advanced, creating an environment of respect, dignity, and autonomy. With what Ian has shown us in the previous chapters, there is a complete absence of respect, dignity, and autonomy. And it is not the goal of the Zionist forefathers to find a peaceful coexistence. Through the teachings of Herzl and the establishment of the state, what you actually have is a progressive policy of ethnically cleansing and removing the people from the land, just like the United States did with the Indians during the early years of the European occupation of North America. It's a systematic system of beliefs that give us that manifest destiny mentality where we are the conquerors and everything that we set our eyes on to conquer is a prize. And we see that not just in Israeli policy, but in the United States policy. Ian tells us that the Israeli government used the British mandates as emergency regulations. That was what I was looking for, as a blueprint for the treatment in dealing with the Palestinian movement. After 1967, it allowed the state of Israel to transition to its own version of those regulations. And I think that that's really what the point of a lot of this was, because as other authors have shown, that Nurit Peled Elhanan shows us in her book how the Holocaust is used as a starting point for the state of Israel. And in it is all of the suffering and the pain and the anger, and using that as the core of their belief going forward. They are trying to establish something where they are the apex predator of the area. They are trying to clear out everything around them that might challenge their existence. So after 1967, that allowed the state of Israel to transition from what the British mandate had used through the emergency regulations into what now exists, the apartheid system, which has its roots in the emergency regulations, but it's a total new entity in itself. And that was created as part of the consequences of 1967. Israel has always held that the occupation and all of the escalations are temporary until a more reasonable, secure solution can be found. And he cites later in the book where he's going to go into that into more detail. But that's always been the excuse, because I can remember even when I was a teenager reading about stories in the weekly readers and stuff that they would distribute at schools. And they always represented the Palestinians as a terrorist group that were a threat to Israelis. And with sorry, with every escalation, there came more infringements, and every situation was not meant to be temporary. It's an act towards a permanent occupation and a permanent expansion of what the state wants to do. The beginning of the escalation for the events in 1967 actually started in 1960, when the shift of the Greater Israel lobby started manifesting what their true goals for the region were. In 1963, a group of Israeli experts from the army, civil services, and academia had planned for this transition. So this is part of moving away from the British mandate's rules into something that they themselves were creating that would suit the needs of the people in the region. They put together a detailed manual on how to run the Palestinian territory according to the emergency regulations should the opportunity arise, which we can look at the events of 1963 to 1967, and we can extrapolate that forward to looking to October 7th, 2023. That didn't happen by accident. There's a policy that is active in which, just like America, don't let a good opportunity, or don't let a tragedy be missed by a good opportunity. And whether it was planned, to what degree they knew it was going to happen, the response to October 7th was pre-planned, and they were just looking for that opportunity to impose this transition, this change. Using military occupation, Palestinians have systematically been denied human and civil rights. They endure ever intrusive escalations and dispossessions. And even in the news now, we're hearing about how Netanyahu passed on to Smotrich, I believe it was, or Gavir, the responsibility of the West Bank. So now the West Bank is under Ben Gavir's purview. Knowing where he stands, what can we expect moving forward? This is not a peaceful resolution. This isn't something where there's going to be mediation. It's a one-sided argument. It's a hostile takeover. All hopes died when Ben Gurion returned to power. Israel joined with Britain and France to depose Nasser. After 1967, the Israel lobby would use the occupation to throttle Palestinian self-determination. When there comes a victory in a situation like this, there's the winner and the loser. And just like watching a football game, you can see how the winners jeer the losers, and they make their celebration part of somebody else's derision. And we see that in our community and society, and we think that that's typical behavior, but it's unnatural to treat people in the way that we treat the people where we're occupying, whether it's the United States or Israel. You know, America has a terrible foreign policy. They have imperialist dreams for the entire world. So seeing how they treat other human beings in light of their responsibility as being the world's peacekeeper, they're completely contradictory. As we read these accounts, one has to wonder if there weren't groups seeking peace. After all, it seems with each escalation, the public seems split between necessity and justification and moral validity. And even up to today, we have parties that try to debate different sides of the argument. But here in America, you only see one side. You only hear one side. And that is the side that the government joins in Israel with to suppress. And we have no idea what's going on. Groups like Gush Emumim, a Messianic settler movement, had pressured the government to shift its illegal appropriations from mostly rural area to suburban areas, because once they had the establishment of those areas, the rural areas no longer became the issue, but the suburban areas did, so that they could control the community, the distribution of goods. They moved more to the city regions than the rural areas. Demographics problem foreseen by Ben Gurion, which had hindered him in the past, were subsumed by the administrative detentions and wide-scale incarcerations of the West Bank and the deporting to Gaza. Bringing Ian's book up to date, considering recent developments, it becomes increasingly clear that with Netanyahu's admission that he has worked to oppose the establishment of a peaceful resolution since he entered politics, and all that preceded him, freedom in Palestine has never been a realistic goal for the Zionists. It's never been something that was legitimately at the table. They've never once brought in a Palestinian to negotiate with. Every person that rises to prominence that shows Palestine a way forward disappears.
They assassinate them.
They assassinate them. And as in the past, Israel currently employs a one-sided attempt at peace talks, knowing that its actions are contrary to actual peace. They set the reality on the ground, and that's their definition of peace. Just like the United States declared a war on terrorism, defining what terrorism is without putting themselves in that equation. So we see not only what Ian is showing us in this book as a historic point, but using that as the blueprint looking forward, we can see how that policy has played out and expanded from 1967 to our current days. Despite the appearance that Israel is operating without a clear set of goals, their end goal has always been clear. Since Theodor Herzl recorded it in Der Judenstaat, with each escalation since 1948, Israel insists that they're acting with no choice. They claim that they have no partner in peace because Israel has systematically assassinated every voice for peaceful resolution since the occupation began. Recently, Ghassan Kanafani's assassination birth date came up, and although I didn't see a lot of posts about him, he was key in peaceful resistance to the occupation. He never took up arms. He was a writer. He was a writer. He thought about how to free these people from occupation, and he never took up weapons. He never participated in the aggressive part of it, and they still killed him, and they killed his niece too. If oppression and occupation are the tools of the occupier rather than an environment of equity, justice, and the pursuit of liberty, both sides will continue to be faced with situations like the ones captured by the photographs above. You can't kill Hamas because resistance to the occupation is Hamas. That's the definition of their resistance. And no matter where it looks, what name it takes, or where it is, resistance to the occupation and the reach of empire is what's at stake here. It's not Palestine. It's not Gaza. This is a global thrust, and Palestine is just the pinnacle. It's the top of the pyramid, and if it were to fall, the rest would fall with it. But that's my presentation. I respected Ian's work. He has a body of work that is just amazing, and I'm learning of new authors every day, because more and more people are becoming aware, and rather than keeping that knowledge to themselves, they're sharing it with the world. And people like Abigail, who has her Substacks, and some of the great authors, Substacks is a good area to get good information from. And I just recently found out about it, probably within the last 4 months. So it's an alternative to the news that we clearly know isn't reflective of the reality that we're living in.
Thank you so much, James. That was a brilliant summary of the chapter, but I really loved what you did, that you added more to that from your own research. I love the photos you used. I'm going to ask you to send me the presentation so I can steal some of your photos, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I also wanted to just add that hiding in plain sight, I think, through the chapter is the wider context of how the West always attempts, in that case, at that time it was the UK more than the US, but attempting to control the regimes in the former colonies to favor their own interests, because there are resources, that there's oil in Iraq, there's oil in there's all kinds of resources everywhere. And now the US is doing it, but back then the UK was doing it. Britain was doing it. So what happened in Egypt, the revolution in Egypt, all these revolutions in the Arab countries, the former colonies, basically are trying to, that there's constant this tug of war between the people who want to cooperate or collude with the West against their own people, basically, because the West brings in capitalism, which causes poverty in their countries, and it's exploiting those countries. But the West prefers to have regimes that support it. And all of that's happening in Israel. You can see how Israel is seizing these opportunities to further its own agenda, which is, and always has been, all the land without the people, from the Jordan River to the sea. The phrase "from the river to the sea" did not just start last year in October with the demonstrations. This is a phrase the Zionists have used from the beginning,
Absolutely.
from the Jordan River to the sea. And I just wanted to say that photo that you had there of these men in underwear on this truck being carted off God knows where by the Israeli forces in 1967, this echoes exactly what's happening in Gaza now. They always strip the men to their underwear, you humiliate them, it's a way of showing power and control, and nobody knows what happens to these people. They can be taken anywhere, anything can be done to them, there's torture. And that's Israel. But like I said to you before we started, I grew up in Israel, and the belief is that all of Israel's wars are of no choice, and the 1967 was a war of no choice. It was imposed on us, and we heroically won it in 6 days. So the songs and the praises in the country and the heroism, you can't hear it. It's nauseating. James, do you maybe you want to say one last word before we close for tonight, because it was your presentation, and I think the comments that were made were really wonderful. They sort of added so many pieces and added richness. What would you like to say to finish today?
Well, we all know the history of the occupation and what Ian's trying to share with the rest of the world. And it takes our understanding and our research. And although it might seem fruitless while we're doing it, and time consuming, and there's other things that we'd rather do with our time, there's no better cause.
And
because
I'm sorry.
One of the greatest teachings of Christ is to do unto others, to serve those that we see that are less fortunate than ourselves. And I know for a fact that is the core of Judaism. That's the core of Islam, that we are all one, that we are joined through our humanity, and we set ourselves apart and we build walls between ourselves. And it's not security. It doesn't give us comfort. It isolates us. and it prevents us from understanding a bigger picture. So each of us are pieces in a puzzle that's so large it would fill the sky. But we have to play our part, and we have to do what we can and develop the ideas that we have, because we each play a part. Everybody, every voice, it matters.
Thank you so much. That's very important, powerful words. If only people listened. Do you know there were Chinese philosophers also 2,500 years ago who had exactly the same message as Jesus and Rabbi Akiva and Islam? Love thy neighbor as yourself, extend love to everyone. It also makes me, one last comment, it just makes me realize why it's so important that we're all grounded in knowledge. It's really, really important that we're going through this book and studying it. And even though I thought I knew everything, I'm finding out that I didn't. And it's still, Ilan is very grateful to Ilan for all the work that he's been doing for us, all the legwork he's doing so that we can be well informed. Everybody, thank you so much for attending today. James, thank you so much for an incredible presentation, your heartfelt words as well. I share your sorrow and your pain about that deeply.
Thank you. I appreciate
Everybody,
it.
put your microphones on to say goodbye if you like, if you wish, before we close. Bye.